Hello, today I'll be talking about the game Hobbit Tales from the Green Dragon Inn. This came out in 2013, which I believe that's probably around the time I got it. I show my only plays of it were 3 times in 2014, which I'm not sure why I haven't played it anymore, but I went ahead and pulled it out today, reread the rules, played through a game by myself, which is not really how this game is meant to be played, but let's talk about how to set up and play. First thing you do is place the board in the middle of the play area. Players each get one of these Green Dragon Inn coasters and place that in front of them. The adventure deck is then shuffled and placed somewhere near the board, as well as the hazard deck is shuffled and placed somewhere near the board. The cheers tokens, this is just a few of them, are placed in an opaque container. I'm just putting mine in this draw bag, but anyway, there's lots of them in here. I didn't see this in the rules for setup, but you'll just place the feet die somewhere nearby as well. And that pretty much completes setup. I've set up here for 3 players, so I got 3 of the coasters, the board, and the decks of cards. And now let's move on with how to play. I should mention one other part of preparations, as it's called in the rule, or setup, is to decide who's going to be your first narrator. This is a storytelling game, so one player will start as the first narrator the first round. The other 2 players will be hazard players, and then each round players will take turns being in clockwise order, being the narrator. So as part of setup, you choose your first narrator. For me, it's going to be this player on my far left here. So let's get started with how to play around. So in this game, players are hobbits sitting around a table drinking a beer at the Green Dragon Inn and telling tales to each other. So the first thing that happens is the first narrator, who's going to be your first storyteller, will draw 4 adventure cards. Now I just wanted to mention the adventure cards and the hazard cards look very similar, but you can see the adventure card has a little bit shinier gold, non-damaged looking icon or coin there, while here on the hazard cards it's a little damaged and worn looking, but they're very similar. Anyway, first thing that happens is your first narrator will draw 4 cards. Then, depending on the number of hazard players, they will draw a number of cards. If you're just playing 2 players, so there's only 1 hazard player, he'll draw 6 cards. If you're playing 3 players, so you have 2 hazard players, they'll draw 3 cards each, which is what we're doing. So I'll have my hazard players draw 3 cards each here. And then if you were playing 4 or 5 players, so you have 3 or 4 hazard players, then they would draw 2 cards each, and the narrator would draw 1 extra adventure card. So just to restate, here in our 3-player game, the narrator has drawn 4 adventure cards, while the hazard players have each drawn 3 hazard cards. Then the narrator player will draw 2 more. I just drew these off the top of the deck. 2 more adventure cards. He will look at those separately and choose one to be his opening, his first card that he's going to start the story with, and one that's going to be the epilogue, which he or she will put face down at the end of the board, which is how they'll end their story. So we'll say our player chooses the warm welcome card. Now they don't tell the other players what their epilogue card is, but they'll choose their opening card, place it on the first space of the board. That card is what the narrator will use to begin their story with. So as you're telling your story with these cards, each of the adventure cards has a title, an image, a quote from a Tolkien story. These icons are used for another game called The One Ring. I believe it's an RPG. I'm not really sure anything about that game, but apparently you can use the cards from this game as some optional rule for that One Ring RPG. Again, I don't know anything about that, so these icons are not used in this game. These icons here are used by the hazard players, and we'll talk about that here shortly. But when the narrator is telling his story, he has to incorporate something from the title or the image or the quote or some or all three of those into the story he's telling as he lays out the cards. And of course, with the opening of his story, he'll have to use this card. And the narrator will look at the other cards he has in his hand to determine maybe how he wants his story to play out. Once he's ready, he'll begin his story with elements from the opening card. And remember, these are hobbits sitting around the table drinking beer, telling tales. So he may start with this opening card and say, whichever hobbit, which the narrator is playing, may say, one summer day, the Brandybuck clan was having a family reunion. They were all sitting around a campfire, and then he may want to continue his story, or he needs to continue his story by playing another card from his hand and incorporating that into the story. And so maybe he chooses this one and says, some unexpected guests arrived. Some men from the town of Bree showed up at the Brandybuck, family reunion. Now, once a second card is played, the hazard players have a chance to interrupt that story. So they will look at the icons that are in play. We have runes, woods, evil eye, and I believe this one is wilds. And I believe there's one more type that's not displayed here. It's like a purple stone looking one that stands for caves. But anyway, once the second card is played, the hazard players then look at those icons and see if they have cards in their hand that can match at least two of the icons in play. So starting with the player to the left of the current narrator. So he'll look at his cards. Now he's got one with caves and wilds, but there's no caves, so he doesn't have that matches. He does have this one that matches his evil eye and wood, so he does match at least two of the icons, so he could play this card. And he's also got this one that's got wilds and wood, so he could play either one of these cards. Now if this player didn't have any that he could play, then the next hazard player in clockwise order would be able to look at his cards and see if he has any to play. But because this player he has the choice of playing one of these two cards, so we'll just say maybe he chooses this goblin trap. So you're trying to interrupt or hinder the story. So the narrator just said, the family reunion was interrupted by unexpected guests of men from Bree, and this player will say, no, I think those guests were waylaid by a goblin trap. I think you're misremembering. So he has an option to play this card, but it has a threat rating on it here. So to see if that actually comes into play, he's got to roll the threat dice, and if he gets equal to or greater than the threat rating, then he's successful. So here he got a 4. He was not successful because the threat rating is 6. He needed to roll a 6 or higher. So then the narrator would say, "No, I think you're misremembering. The men were not caught in a goblin trap," and then he can carry on his story. Whereas if this player had been successful and maybe rolled a 7, then the player that played that would have to kind of tell a little story and say, yes, the men from Bree were traveling to your family reunion, but they were caught in a goblin trap and never made it. And so that story card that narrator played would be removed and not be able to be played on the board. Then the hazard player that was able to successfully play that card gets to draw a cheers token from the bag, and they look at it and they choose whether to place that on top of their coaster face down or underneath their coaster. And I'll explain more about what the purpose of that is when we get to scoring, but we'll just say, for example, he put that one underneath. So now the narrator has to continue his story with fewer cards. And so in this example, he may have to say, "Oh yes, you're right. The men from Bree never did make it. To the gathering at that time." So after gathering outside by the fire for a while, we all went into Balula Brandybuck's house. And now he's played another story card, and now the hazard players again get to check if they have any icons that match. Any of their cards have icons that match 2 of the icons on the 2 cards played. We'll say in this example they don't, so then the player could continue his story and say, after a while, Tallulah noticed that her good silverware had been stolen. So now, since another card has been placed, the hazard players again get to see if they have a card they can play, but they play off the last 2 cards, so they can no longer use the icons on this card. They would look if they have any cards that match the icons on these 2 cards. And if they do, then they could play them, and if they're successful in playing them, then this card would be removed. If not, then the player would get to play another one and continue his story. Once he runs out of cards, if he has not reached the last space, if the last space has not been filled, he then just has to draw the top card from the adventure deck and play that card and continue his story, come up with some story element that card incorporates. And again, when he plays that last card, the hazard players have the opportunity to play a card to interrupt. It's called improvising when you've run out of cards from your hand of cards and you didn't finish because some of your cards were removed by hazard cards. So once you have to start drawing cards from the deck and improvising, if somebody successfully plays a hazard card against one of the cards you're improvising with, so in this example, we'll say this hazard player, the narrator plays this story card, comes up with some story about it, but this hazard player has this card that has the woods and the wilds icon, so there's a woods and a wild on the last 2 cards. Again, you're always trying to play hazards against the icons on the last 2 cards. So he plays this one. Let's say he rolled the dice and was successful, got an 8, which is higher than the 6th threat level. So this card is removed. Because you were improvising at that point, if one of your cards that you're improvising with is removed or blocked by a hazard play, then that is a premature ending to your story. The storyteller reveals his epilogue card, but kind of has to incorporate that into his story, but he must end it on like a sad or negative note. So that would end the story. Now, if you were able to play your last card successfully, and that was not removed, then at that point you would just go ahead and reveal your epilogue card, incorporate that into your story, but end your story on a positive note. And the difference would be in scoring. When the narrator ends his story, he draws cheers tokens equal to the number of cards played on the storyboard, and if he ended his story, if he was able to do the full story and end his story successfully, then he gets to draw a cheers token for the epilogue card as well. If, however, he had to end his story prematurely because he ran out of cards and he was improvising, and one of his improvised cards was blocked by a hazard, and that made him end his story, then he would only get cheers tokens for the cards he played on the board. And even though he has to reveal his epilogue card and come up with a negative ending for his story, he does not get to draw a cheers token for the epilogue card in that case. So once the narrator has collected his cheers tokens for finishing or not finishing his story, then all cards from the hazard players and the cards on the board are discarded. Play will then resume with the next player in clockwise order becoming the narrator, where he'll draw 4 adventure cards into his hand. The other 2 players, if you're playing 3-player game, will draw 3 hazard card into their hand, and then that player will draw, then the narrator for that round will draw 2 adventure cards, one to be the opening and one to be the epilogue, and you'll play another round similar as we talked about. And so you'll do that until each player has had a turn to be the narrator, and then you'll go to scoring. So before we go to scoring, I want to talk about a couple icons on cards and on this dice that I didn't talk about before. If, like for instance, on this lucky card, if the narrator plays a card that has this icon on it, it's like a spade, then the player to his left immediately gets to draw a hazard card into their hand. If the narrator plays a card onto the board that has 2 of those spade icons, then all the hazard players get to draw a hazard card immediately into their hand. If the narrator plays a card with this eye icon on it onto the board, and one of the hazard players is able to play a hazard card, they don't have to roll the fate die. It's just automatically successful, as if they'd gotten an eye result on the die, which we hadn't talked about before, but let's talk about what happens if a player gets the eye result when he's playing a hazard. If a player playing the hazard card rolls the eye, then he is successful, and his hazard is successful, and he gets to draw 2 cheers tokens out of the bag instead of 1, but he only gets to keep 1. So he looks at the 2, chooses 1 to keep, and then puts the other one back into the container. So that's the same if the narrator plays a card with the eye and one of the hazard players is able to play a hazard card, then they get that same result. So they're automatically successful, and they get to draw 2 cheers tokens and keep 1 and return the other to the cup or bag or wherever the cheers tokens are being held. If the hazard player rolls a Will of the West icon, then he fails, and not only does he fail with his hazard, but the narrator gets to draw a cheers token. Now, I will mention there's some optional rules that allow re-rolling of the feat die when players trying to play a hazard, but I'm not going to talk about those in this video. But I just wanted to mention that there is an optional roll to allow hazard players to play cards to re-roll the feat die. Alright, I think that covers all the icons I hadn't mentioned before. So again, after all the players have had a chance to be the narrator and tell their story, then we get to the in-game scoring. So when you get to the in-game scoring, all players will reveal the tokens they placed under their coaster, and they get to score. They get their basic score by adding up their 4 highest tokens. Now, this person only had 4 tokens underneath their coaster, so they just get their total, which is 7, 5, 6, 7. This player would reveal his. Now, he has more than 4, so he just gets to score his 4 highest, which would be here, so 5, 6, 7, 8. This one won't count because you only score your 4 highest. And this guy only has 3, and he got 3, 5, 6, 7. So as of now, the basic score, this guy's winning with a total of 8. The tokens then on top of their coasters are revealed. This is what they use to buy rounds of beers for players. And they add up their 3 highest tokens. So this guy only has 2, so he just has a total of 2. This guy only has 2, so he has a total of 2. And this guy only has 3, so he gets to add all 3. Again, it's your 3 highest. So he has a total of 4. Whoever has the highest total on top of their coaster gets a total of 4 additional points. Now, it just happened that this guy had a total of 4, and he gets 4 additional points, but it didn't matter if he had 7 points on here on top of his coaster. Whoever has the highest on top of their coaster gets 4 additional points added to their basic score. So this guy would have a total of 11 then, so 7 plus 4 additional for having the most on top, so a total of 11, which would beat this guy's 8 and this guy's 7. That player has not declared the winner yet. If you're playing a game with more than 2 players, like we are here, a 3-player game, then the players that had the 2 highest score kind of are in a competition. The player or players that were not the 2 highest scorers then decide between the players that are the 2 highest scorers who had told the better story during their narration, and whichever one of those players is determined to have told the better story gets to draw 2 additional cheers tokens from the bag or container and add those to their score. And then whoever has the higher score is declared the winner of the game. So, I mean, that's it. It's a pretty quick, simple game to play. It's not always so simple to come up with a good storyline, but what I'm going to go ahead and do, in the back of the rule book they have a good detailed example of play, and so that's what I'm going to set up, and I'll go through as my example turns. Alright, well, we're all set up to go through our example turn. I'm going to use the example turn and text given in the rule book because I think it's pretty good. So we'll start out with the narrator will be this player. He'll draw his initial 4 cards, and he gets Guarded Horde, Boats, Nasty Weather, and Forest Stream. Alright, the first hazard player is going to draw his 3 cards. Again, they keep these in their hand, not so the other players can see them. I just have to do that because I'm playing solo. So he gets Sorcery, Wildfire, and Goblin Trap. And the second hazard player draws his cards. He gets Cave Troll, Orc Chieftain, and Nameless Horror. Alright, next the narrator will draw 2 more cards from the adventure deck, and he'll look at them and choose one to be his opening and one to be his epilogue. So he's going to put his epilogue as Forsaken Inn and put that at the end of the board. That'll be his epilogue, and he's going to open with Many Meetings. So after looking at his cards and what he's going to open with, he starts narrating, and he says, "As you all know, we hobbits of the Strong Knuckles family hold a number of family meetings at Yuletide. We get together at the largest hobbit hole, that of my Uncle Barnabas, and enjoy the company of our sons, daughters, nephews, and nieces while smoking a good pipe or two." So here he's using the mini meetings to talk about this gathering. So then he continues. "At the end of one of those parties, I was returning home, tapping a merry tune on the road using my walking stick. Suddenly, it started to rain. Now I can," and then he plays Nasty Weather. He says, "Now I can endure some water as any hobbit, even if I certainly prefer a good ale. But in a few moments it was raining cats and dogs," and he plays the Nasty Weather card. So now, because there's 2 cards, the hazard players have the opportunity to play a hazard. So the icons available right now are woods, runes, caves, and wilds. So the first hazard player will look at his cards and see what he has. Well, he sees that he has this sorcery card that requires runes and wilds, which are available on those 2 cards. So he decides to interrupt and play his sorcery card. And when he plays the card, he kind of interrupts the story and says, "Was it that night you started to feel dizzy and wandered into the old forest?" Now the threat rating on that card is a 5, so he has to roll the die, and we'll say he rolls a 7 and he's successful. So this card will be blocked and not played. So the hazard player kind of continues his story and says, "Oh yes, I remember that night well. You were so drunk you didn't realize you were under an evil spell and lost your way in the woods." And now, because he successfully played a hazard card, he gets to draw a cheers token. So he draws one, looks at it, it's a 2. He decides to keep that and put it underneath his coaster. So now the narrator has to continue with the cards that he has, and he has to incorporate what the hazard player said about his story, how he kind of changed his story. So now the narrator continues and says, "Indeed it was that night. I wanted to forget that feeling. I shudder at the thought. I don't remember how long I walked, but I'm sure that whoever put that wicked spell would have had me if I didn't fall headlong into the forest stream." And then he plays Forest Stream. "Its freezing waters snap me free from the enchantment." So now 2 cards are played again, so the hazard players again have an opportunity to play a hazard if they can. This time we just have woods and runes. But first, because this card has this special icon that was played, the first hazard player to the left of the narrator gets to draw another hazard card. So he draws this one, and he gets Wild Wolves into his hand. So the hazard players will look to see if they can play anything. Well, this one requires wilds and woods. There's no wilds available. This one requires Evil Eye and wilds. We know that's not available. And this one requires 2 caves. So this hazard player definitely can't play anything. So now the second hazard player looks. His cave and Evil Eye, cave and runes. Well, there is runes, but there's no cave, so he can't play that. And wilds and caves. So neither of the hazard players can play a hazard, so the narrator can just continue on. So he continues his story. It is a great fortune that I have some brandy buck blood in me from the part of my great-great-grandfather. As soon as I fell into the water, I started swimming. Any of you in my place would have drowned instantly. Well, I think I followed the current for at least 1 mile until I spied some feeble light in the dark. A boat was coming my way, a lamp suspended from its prow, and then he plays his boat's card. So now, again, the hazard players have a chance to play hazard, but off of these two cards, not including this one. So we have icons of wilds and runes. Again, the hazard players look. Well, that's cave, wild and evil eye, and wild and woods. So this hazard player can't play anything. This guy's got wild and cave, rune and cave and evil eye. So no, neither of the hazard players can play, so the narrator can continue on. So he continues his stories. You think it was elves maybe, or one of those nosy strangers, the rangers? No, it was one of the big folk, and I never encountered before. He was old and gaunt and probably deaf and a little blind, as he didn't notice me as I clinged to the side of the boat. I was too tired to cry for help and just remained still as the boat continued on. After a while, the old man brought the boat to a shingly shore and climbed slowly down to enter a cave opening. He was bent as if carrying something heavy. Then I saw it. He was carrying a wooden chest. And then he plays his last card, the guarded hoard. So now the hazard players have an opportunity to play off of these two cards, the last two cards in play. So we have wilds and caves. So the first hazard player looks, well, he's got wilds and woods, evil eye and wilds, and caves, so he doesn't have anything. Second hazard player is caves and evil eye, caves and runes, and then he does have wilds and caves, which is available. So he plays his cave troll card and says, and that was when the cave troll came out of the cave to smash you both. The threat rating on that card is a 5, so he rolls the feat dice. Unfortunately, he rolls a 4, which is lower. He has to get equal to or greater, so that's a failure, so he doesn't end up blocking the narrator's card after all. So the narrator can continue, though he is out of cards, so now he has to start improvising by drawing a card from the adventure deck. So first, to incorporate the card that failed by the hazard player, he says, you shouldn't keep drinking that nasty liquor that your aunt distills. Of course it wasn't that night. So then he draws the top card from the adventure deck, and he got unexpected guests, and he plays that. Continuing his story, he says, so as I was saying, the old man was entering the cave carrying his chest with him. I naturally wanted to see where he was going and what was in the chest, so I dragged myself on the shore and followed him. Nothing in the world could prepare me for what I saw. There in the old cave, in the old forest, a whole bunch of old ghosts was sitting in front of the chest filled with gold. They sat with hungry eyes, clawing at the intangible treasure. And actually, that's when he would play the unexpected guest card. So now the hazard players have the opportunity to play against these two cards. So we got caves, wilds, woods, and runes. So the first hazard player, notice he has Goblin Trap, which has wilds and woods, which is available among those two cards. So he plays that down, saying, they say down in the caves under the old forest, it's not the ghosts you have to fear, but the blades of goblins and orcs, and that's when he plays Goblin Trap. Goblin Trap has a threat rating of 6. The hazard player rolls the die and gets an 8, successful. So the unexpected guest card that was played is blocked. And so the hazard player that successfully blocked that card kind of continues his story and says, "You were still frozen with terror when the goblins grabbed you in their filthy paws and brought you deep underground. You'll never see the light of day again," they yelled. Now, since the narrator had his card successfully blocked while he was improvising, he has to bring his story to a close, premature ending. He doesn't get to draw another adventure card. And he has to end it on a negative note, so he reveals his epilogue, The Forsaken Inn, and he says, "What an unfortunate night. I spent many long days and nights in the tunnels of the goblins. I count myself lucky that they didn't eat me, but dropped me somewhere in the dark instead. When I finally emerged from their dungeons, I was starving and wandered aimlessly until I reached the Forsaken Inn." And so that's where he incorporates the Forsaken Inn. So that ends the narrator's turn because he didn't complete the story, get to successfully place a last card on the board. He now gets to draw cheers tokens for all the cards he did play on the board, but he doesn't get to include the Forsaken Inn card since he was not successful in completing a story. So he would draw 4 cheers tokens and decide whether to put them all underneath his coaster to score for his basic score, or put some of them on top to buy rounds of beer. And I said those will be used for a bonus. Whoever has the most of those at the end will get a bonus 4 points. And then all the cards would be cleared. All the hazard players would discard their cards. All the cards discarded. And then a new round would begin with this player as the narrator drawing 4 new cards, and the 2 new hazard players would draw 3 cards each of the hazard deck, and continue on until each one's been the narrator, and then you'd score, as I talked about how scoring works before. And that's it. So I mentioned, I got this in 2013, I think, or maybe it was 2014. And I think the game came out in 2013, and I know my 3 plays of it were in 2014. And then I hadn't played it again, and I'm not sure why, because I remember when playing this back in 2014 that, every time that we did play it, we were just laughing and having a good time, and people making up their crazy stories. So I think it's a fun game, and it doesn't take maybe 20-30 minutes to play once you get going. So yeah, I'm not sure, and I'm not sure if this is available anymore. I don't really hear about it. But anyway, if you like a game where you get to make up a story, you can't really take too seriously the scoring, because you're randomly drawing those cheers tokens that may have you may get 4 pull 4 tokens, and they all just have 1s on them. So it's kind of lucky in that regard as far as scoring, but just for having a fun time, if you don't care too much about who wins from the scoring, I think it's a good fun game. Anyway, I'm going to wrap it up. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it.